A whisper behind a curtain, a body before morning. Welcome to Tea and Clues. I am your host, Daxon. Let me know where you're listening from. Your comments bring this mystery world to life. Always grateful to have you here. Let's dive in. It was in the latter half of November, a time when the London fog lay thick and persistent over Baker Street, that a case most peculiar first stirred the keen faculties of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The weather had settled into its customary gloom, and with it came a silence that was broken only by the occasional clatter of hooves or the faint hiss of gas lamps fighting back the encroaching dark. We had been enjoying a quiet stretch, Holmes immersed in a treatise on medieval poisons, and I penning the last pages of a medical monograph which I suspected neither Holmes nor any other soul would bother to read. It was nearing 4:30 in the afternoon when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, entered with a letter, unsealed, folded, and bearing neither return address nor postage. "A gentleman left this for Mr. Holmes not 10 minutes ago," she said. "Wouldn't give his name, just said it was urgent and left straight away. Didn't even wait for me to call down a hansom." Holmes reached for the letter with that familiar flick of indifference he reserved for everything save criminal puzzles. He unfolded it, and as his eyes darted across the contents, I saw the subtle stiffening of his shoulders. "Watson," he said, his voice low but brisk, "would you be so kind as to fetch my coat and gloves? We have a matter to attend to at once." "Indeed," I replied, standing. "Has someone been murdered?" "No, at least not yet, but someone is very afraid they will be. Listen." He held out the letter to me. The message was brief, scrawled. In an unsteady hand, "Come at once to 17 Bleakmere Row, Kensington. I am in danger. Tell no one. Do not speak my name aloud. I beg you. Only a whisper brought me warning." "A friend, Bleakmere Row," I mused aloud. "That's a rather obscure corner, if I recall." "Obscurity often suits those who wish not to be found," Holmes said, already shrugging on his Inverness cape. "And what do you make of the phrase, 'only a whisper brought me warning'?" I considered it. "A poetic turn, perhaps? Or someone prone to dramatics?" "Poetic, yes. But in my experience, Watson, people under duress rarely take to poetry unless it is as a desperate code. The choice of words, whisper, tell no one, do not speak my name, suggests a fear not of violence, but of being overheard. We are being drawn into a game of secrecy, and I dare say the first move has already been played." And with that, we descended the stairs and emerged into the foggy streets of London, where gaslight halos danced in the mist, and the air carried the smell of soot and suspense. The journey to Bleakmere Row was conducted in near silence, save for the clatter of our hansom cab over cobblestones. Kensington's smarter streets soon gave way to more modest dwellings, until at last we stopped before a narrow, sombre-looking townhouse, number 17, nestled in a cul-de-sac few carriages would find by accident. Holmes knocked twice, softly, as if not to disturb the very air. We waited. A minute passed, then 2. No sound from within. "Curious," Holmes murmured. He tried the handle. It turned. The door creaked open. The hallway beyond was shrouded in shadow. A single lamp flickered on the wall, illuminating dust. Motes swirling in the stale air. Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. I followed, though uneasily. "Hello?" I called, my voice unnaturally loud in the hush. No answer. Holmes moved quickly, his steps silent. He inspected the small sitting room off the corridor, empty save for a cracked mirror, 2 velvet armchairs, and a faint smell of lavender and old books. Then, at the end of the corridor, we found the study. And there, seated upright at the desk, his eyes wide and staring, was a man of perhaps 50 years, grey-haired, well-dressed, and unmistakably dead. On the blotter before him lay another folded note. Holmes reached for it, examined it briefly, and then passed it to me without a word. I heard the whisper again. This time it said, "You know too much." Holmes crouched beside the body with the fluid grace of a predator at rest, his long fingers moving delicately from the man's wrist to his collar, then up to the pale, expressionless face. I stood, a few steps behind, struck by the eerie stillness that clung to the room. The study, though handsomely furnished with a mahogany desk, leather-bound volumes and thick curtains drawn against the windows, felt as though it had not been disturbed in years. The ticking of a small brass clock on the mantel was the only sound that marked the passage of time. "There is no sign of a struggle," I whispered, my eyes scanning the room. "No overturned furniture, no bruising on the hands or face. Could it be natural causes?" Holmes gave a slight shake of his head. "Unlikely, Watson. Look here. Note the pallor of the lips and fingertips. Cyanosis. And smell." He leaned closer, inhaling slightly through his nose. "There is a faint bitterness in the air. Something acrid, though very subtle. It suggests poisoning, fast-acting and likely inhaled." "Gas?" I asked, instinctively glancing at the lamp on the desk. "No. The gas mantle is intact and the flame regular. If this were the source, we would expect more irritation to the eyes or signs of disarray from a sudden reaction. Now I suspect a more refined method." He stood and moved toward a nearby bookshelf, pulling volumes aside one by one, checking behind them. This was not the work of a common murderer. This was planned, quietly, cleverly, as if the killer feared noise more than suspicion. I examined the note again. I heard the whisper again. This time it said, "You know too much." Chilling words, and yet almost theatrical. "Whoever this man was," I said, "he clearly anticipated danger. He knew it would return." Holmes had turned to a small writing cabinet in the corner and was now picking the lock with a fine instrument from his pocket. Anticipated, and perhaps invited it. People do not write messages like this unless they feel they're being watched or manipulated. There is fear here, yes, but also resignation. The lock clicked open. Holmes drew out a stack of papers, flipping rapidly through them. Receipts, letters, a telegram or two. Then he stopped and held up a folded parchment, yellowed and sealed with a broken red crest. "Ah," he said softly, "here lies the beginning of our trail." He handed it to me. The paper bore an old letterhead, "Aberwick and Montrose, legal representatives to the estate of Baron Elric Wetherell." Dated nearly 20 years prior, the letter was a terse notice informing a Mr. Charles Bryce, presumably our unfortunate victim, that the late Baron's final codicil had been altered to exclude one Richard Wetherell from any inheritance, citing moral turpitude and actions unbefitting a gentleman. "Bryce must have been the solicitor," I said, "or the witness to the change," Holmes murmured. Either way, someone thought his silence was essential, until perhaps he chose not to remain silent. I turned back toward the body. Then this whisper. Could it be literal? Someone warning him not to speak? Or a metaphor? Holmes replied, "But we must treat it as both until proven otherwise." At that moment, a soft sound from the corridor startled us both. A creak of floorboard, faint but unmistakable. Holmes was at the door in an instant, wrenching it open with one swift motion. The hallway beyond lay empty, yet Holmes did not move. His eyes had narrowed. "Watson," he said, his voice low. Light footsteps, not more than a minute old, and, yes. He bent to the floor, where a smudge of damp earth marred the otherwise immaculate rug. Someone entered after us, watched and slipped away. We gave brief chase through the back of the house, but the yard yielded nothing. No footprints, no sign of escape, only a broken latch on the rear gate and the shadowed hush of the fog beyond. Holmes lingered at the threshold a moment longer, then turned back inside. When the constables from Kensington Station arrived, summoned by a neighbour who had glimpsed our cab and grown curious, Holmes had already written out a summary of the man's identity and likely cause of death, omitting only the most critical deductions. The name Charles Bryce matched records they held for a retired legal clerk who had been living in seclusion for several years. Inspector Lestrade arrived shortly thereafter, his face already set in that familiar expression of irritation tempered by reluctant respect. "So we're beginning another chase, are we, Mr. Holmes?" he said as he examined the body. "No sign of forced entry, no wounds and no known enemies. Sounds like a nice tidy suicide if you ask me." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet the man who commits suicide rarely leaves cryptic notes about whispers, Inspector. Nor does he hide legal documents from 20 years ago behind a false panel in his study." "Suicide's just a word until the coroner says otherwise," Lestrade muttered. "Still, you've always had a nose for the odd ones. What's your theory?" That someone silenced a man whose knowledge was inconvenient, Holmes replied. Whether that knowledge pertains to a family scandal, a hidden inheritance, or a crime long buried, I cannot yet say. But we are no longer dealing with threats in the present. We are stepping into a puzzle that began decades ago. Lestrade scoffed. And how do you propose to dig up old secrets without a single suspect? Holmes smiled again. We already have one, or at least a name. He held up the letter bearing the old seal. Richard Wetherell. Lestrade looked unimpressed. You believe this fellow did it? I believe he has a reason to lie low, and a reason perhaps to silence the man who once removed him from fortune. As the police began their work, Holmes and I stepped once more into the fog-drenched street. He walked in silence for several paces, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed ahead. Watson, he said at last, do you recall the case of the man who vanished at the opera? Of course, I said, startled. The one where the wife had been sending herself letters for weeks in advance of his disappearance. A curious business, Holmes mused, but it taught me something, that the faintest inconsistencies, when properly arranged, can tell you not only who the criminal is, but also what he fears most. And what do you believe Richard Wetherell fears? Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing in thought. Then, without looking at me, he said, a whisper. Because a whisper cannot be traced, but it can still condemn. He hailed a cab. Come, Watson, to Gray's Inn. We must learn who else Charles Bryce once served, and what secrets he was too afraid to speak aloud. And with that, we vanished. Into the London mist once more, chasing shadows that had begun to stir long before either of us arrived at number 17 Bleakmere Row. The cab jolted over the cobblestones as we turned from the dim lanes of Kensington into the heavier traffic of the Strand. Holmes sat opposite me, his face drawn into that cold, hawk-like mask I had come to associate with deep calculation. He had not spoken since giving the cabby directions, and I judged it best not to interrupt the silent workings of his mind. Instead, I turned over the facts in my own. The solicitor, Charles Bryce, was dead, likely poisoned and almost certainly silenced for a matter connected to a decades-old alteration of a nobleman's will. The name Richard Wetherell, disinherited and condemned in the codicil, now emerged like a ghost summoned from the past. And then there was the whisper, both in the note and presumably in reality, a warning or threat overheard and taken seriously enough to summon Holmes in secret. What troubled me most, however, was the stealthy presence in the house. Someone had entered after us, unseen and silent, and had left without a trace save for a trace of mud. We arrived at Gray's Inn just as the last light of day faded behind the rooftops, leaving the law chambers bathed in the soft amber glow of gas lamps. The porter, a thin, rheumatic man who seemed to have grown into the woodwork of the lodge, confirmed that Mr. Bryce had once leased rooms on the second floor of Building C, but had retired from practice some 10 years earlier. He was a quiet sort, the porter said, rubbing at a rheumy eye. Always came and went alone, no callers that I remember, but he kept up a correspondence, he did. Letters in and out, regular as clockwork. Holmes's eyes sharpened. To whom? The porter shrugged. Couldn't say. Don't know if it was family or business. But there was a gentleman, dark-haired, foreign-looking, used to come every December for a few years. Never gave his name. Had a scar along his jaw. Scar along the jaw, Holmes repeated softly, filing the detail away. And you haven't seen him since? Not in years. I always thought he had something to do with Bryce's retirement. If you catch my meaning. Indeed, Holmes said. Was Bryce's correspondence ever handled through a clerk here? The porter nodded. Miss Fortescue, I believe. She's still in chambers. Room 18. Keeps files from the old clients. Very precise. We found Miss Fortescue exactly as described, an upright, no-nonsense woman with sharp spectacles and a sharper tongue who warmed only marginally when Holmes dropped the name of Charles Bryce. Mr. Bryce was a meticulous man, she said, unlocking a narrow cabinet behind her desk. He left instructions that certain files be preserved and others destroyed. Naturally, I kept a discreet copy of everything. One learns not to take chances in this business. She drew forth a leather-bound folder labelled Wetherell Estate, Confidential. Holmes took it with a murmur of thanks and opened it across her desk. I leaned in beside him as he leafed through. There was a flurry of correspondence between Bryce and various agents, largely legal in nature, but two pieces stood out. One was a short, unsigned letter postmarked Geneva, dated 5 years prior, requesting information on the circumstances of Lord Elric Wetherell's last testament and the man named therein. The second was a reply, penned by Bryce, explaining that no official challenge had been mounted to the codicil and that its provisions remained legally binding. No return address, I noted. And no name. Holmes tapped the Geneva postmark. But the handwriting, bold, deliberate strokes, slight rightward slant, suggests a writer used to dictation and command. "This man is not the sort to accept defeat easily," Miss Fortescue interrupted with a dry cough. "If I may, gentlemen, there was one other item I felt peculiar enough to retain." She reached into her bottom drawer and withdrew a small envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a strip of heavy parchment, no more than a few inches long. On it were 3 lines, written in ink so faded it was nearly illegible. "The bell tower knows the secret. The whisper lives beneath the stone. If you listen too closely, you'll hear your name." Holmes studied it in silence. "A riddle?" I asked. "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or a warning. Whatever its nature, Bryce kept it. That suggests he found it meaningful. Miss Fortescue, do you know where this came from?" "I found it tucked inside his personal ledger after he retired," she replied. "No envelope, no explanation. I was about to discard it until I read the lines. Something about it felt uneasy." "Uneasy," Holmes echoed. "Yes, as if whoever wrote it expected to be read not in curiosity, but in fear." Back on the street, Holmes moved with renewed urgency. "We must visit the Wetherell estate. Watson, or what remains of it. If we're lucky, the bell tower still stands." "But that's north of the city," I protested. "We'd have to wait until morning." Holmes gave me a tight smile. "Do you recall the last time we waited, Watson? A man was dead before dawn. No, I think we'll go tonight." An hour later, wrapped in the full chill of the November air, we stood before the rusted gates of Wetherell Hall. The estate had fallen into disrepair, a sprawling, overgrown property nestled beyond Highgate, with gnarled trees crowding the approach and ivy choking the walls of the main house. The bell tower loomed above the ruins like a solitary sentinel, its spire half shrouded in mist. Holmes picked the lock on the gate in seconds and pushed it open. The crunch of our boots on gravel echoed like thunder in the still night. We reached the base of the tower without incident, but as we prepared to enter, Holmes raised a hand. "Do you smell that?" he whispered. I sniffed. There was something, an oily, metallic tang to the air. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint, inhuman. It came again, a soft hiss, like breath forced through cloth. Holmes crouched instantly, signaling for silence. From the far side of the tower, a figure had emerged, tall, gloved, with a scarf covering his face. He held something in his left hand, an atomizer or spray of some kind. Before I could act, Holmes surged forward, knocking the object away and grappling with the man in a sudden, brutal flurry. They struggled only seconds before Holmes subdued him with a sharp blow to the side. The man crumpled to the ground. Holmes stood over him, breathing hard. "A whisper, Watson," he said grimly, "manufactured with gas and fear." He bent and pulled down the scarf. I gasped. The man's jaw bore a long white scar. The face from Gray's Inn, the visitor in December. Holmes turned to me. "Our suspect just made a very loud mistake," and the bell above us, silent for years, gave a sudden creak as though awakened. Holmes crouched beside the unconscious man, fingers probing the inside of the coat pockets with swift precision. From within, he withdrew a crumpled cloth pouch, stained at the seams, and then the object we had glimpsed moments before, the atomizer, a small brass contraption fitted with a glass vial. Faint traces of a milky vapor still clinging to its rim. He held it up to the moonlight. "Chloroform," he muttered. "Diluted, mixed with camphor and, yes, I believe, oil of eucalyptus. A paralytic blend strong enough to make a man disoriented, pliable, or, if applied long enough, helpless." Precisely the kind of device one might use to create the illusion of a whisper in the dark, while doing far greater harm in the process. He rose to his full height, eyes gleaming. Our adversary is no murderer in the common sense, Watson. He is a craftsman of silence. The man stirred slightly, and Holmes nudged him with the toe of his boot, not unkindly but firmly enough, to rouse him to consciousness. The man's eyes flickered open, dark and wary beneath his pale brow. For a moment he stared up at Holmes with unmasked resentment. Then, without a word, he turned his head and spat into the grass. Holmes was unruffled. "Richard Wetherell, I presume." The man flinched, just slightly. "Enough. I never knew a man with a scar so distinctive who was content to live nameless," Holmes continued. "And I rather think you've grown tired of being hunted. You knew Bryce would not hold your secrets. Forever, didn't you?" "You know nothing," Wetherell rasped. "On the contrary," Holmes said smoothly, "I know you returned from exile under a false name and have been living within a modest flat off Marylebone Road these past 2 years. I know you made contact with Bryce last autumn, and when he refused your proposition, perhaps blackmail, perhaps silence, you began your campaign of whispers. I also know you visited Geneva not long before the first letter reached him. Likely to find someone with skill in distillation." Wetherell's expression hardened, but he said nothing. I stepped forward. "He's right, you know. We have your letters, your handwriting. A witness at Gray's Inn remembered the scar, and you were found lurking at the very estate your family once ruled, attempting to disable or frighten us with a weapon disguised as a whisper." Holmes bent closer, his voice quiet but deadly focused. "Why did you return, Wetherell? The barony was lost to you long ago. The estate is worthless now. No servants, no title, no wealth." Wetherell's mouth twisted. "It was never about wealth," he said bitterly. "It was about honor, about truth. My father disinherited me on the basis of a lie, crafted by Bryce and sealed with that damn codicil. He wrote me out of existence for an accusation he never dared say aloud, and I have lived in shadow since." "What accusation?" I asked. Holmes was already ahead of me. "You were accused of sedition, possibly treason. A quiet affair, covered, up to protect the family's reputation, but the claim was never proven." Wetherell's eyes burned. "Because it was never true. I served in India with distinction, until an anonymous letter accused me of passing correspondence to certain Punjabi dissidents. Bryce was the one who handled the legal proceedings that followed, and my father believed every word. No hearing, no trial, just a signature. I returned to find my name erased and my home a mausoleum." "And the whispers?" Holmes asked. Flicker of shame crossed the man's face. "I wanted him to feel hunted, to feel what I felt, not to die, only to doubt, to wonder if his secrets were safe. But I swear to you I never meant to kill him." Holmes was silent for a long moment. "Believe you," he said at last. "But I also believe you are not alone." Wetherell blinked. "What do you mean?" "There's a pattern here," Holmes said slowly. "One that does not end with Bryce. The telegrams in his study, the Geneva letter, even this." He held up the fragment of parchment. "Suggest that someone else, someone outside the Wetherell family, has a vested interest in what that codicil protected. A third party who feared exposure, or worse, a loss of control." I frowned. "You think someone else was manipulating both Bryce and Wetherell?" Holmes nodded. "And I believe that person has already moved again." He stood and turned back toward the manor. "Watson, bring him with us. There's something else here. Something Bryce feared but never named. It lies beneath the stone, those were the words. We must search." With Wetherell limping between us, we ascended the steps of the old tower and entered a narrow vestibule beneath the bell. The air was musty, the walls lined with plaques bearing the names of Wetherell ancestors. At the far end, a heavy flagstone lay partly dislodged as if pried up recently and returned without care. Holmes crouched and examined the seam. "Fresh scratches here. The mortar is crumbling. Look, it flakes at the touch. Someone was here within the week." He gripped the edge of the stone and heaved. With effort, it tilted free. Beneath lay a small cavity, and within it, wrapped in oilskin, a bundle of documents tied with black ribbon. Holmes retrieved them carefully. They were brittle with age, but intact. The topmost bore the seal of the Home Office. He read silently, his brows knitting tighter with every line. "Good Lord," he muttered. "Watson, these are classified military records, communications intercepted in Calcutta, names, cipher keys. And here is the real blow, a signed letter from Lord Elric to a contact in the Foreign Office, confirming that the charge against his son was a decoy, a sacrifice." I stared at him. "You mean Richard was innocent all along?" "More than that. He was framed by the Crown itself to conceal the actions of another agent who was too valuable to lose." Holmes looked over at Wetherell, who stood trembling. "You were right," Holmes said softly. "But your father chose duty. Over blood, he buried the truth to preserve the Empire." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rustle of wind through broken panes. The truth had been exhumed, not from a criminal's mind, but from the very bones of the house. Wetherell closed his eyes. "I don't want the title," he said. "I don't want the land. But let it be known, I wasn't the traitor." Holmes placed the documents back in the pouch. "It shall be known," he said. "By morning, this will be in the hands of those who still possess honor within the system." And as we stepped back into the night, I could not help but feel the weight of a family's silence finally lifted, not by vengeance nor whispers, but by the sheer clarity of Holmes's relentless logic. The fog had thickened by the time we descended from the tower, curling in heavy coils along the cracked flagstones and pooling at our feet like a living shroud. Richard Wetherell walked in, silence between us, his posture no longer defiant but oddly composed, as if the unearthing of the hidden truth had worn away the last fragments of bitterness. Holmes, ever attuned to human subtleties, said nothing, though I noted the occasional glance he cast at our companion, not of suspicion now, but of study, as if trying to reconcile the man with the reputation that had so long shadowed him. Back. On the road, we flagged a cab from a passing wagon driver headed toward the city. Holmes pressed a sovereign into the man's hand and instructed him to take us to Scotland Yard by way of Montague Street. I opened my mouth to question the detour, but Holmes answered before I could speak. "There is one more thread left dangling, Watson," he said. "A thread we cannot afford to leave untied." He removed the oilskin bundle from his coat and tapped it lightly. "These papers confirm the innocence of Richard Wetherell, but they also implicate another, a man whose name appears not once in these records, and yet whose hand I now believe has guided this affair from the start." I looked at him sharply. "Not Bryce?" "No. Bryce was merely the keeper of the door. Someone else handed him the key, someone who knew the truth all along and ensured that it remained hidden." Wetherell stirred. "Do you speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes? If there is someone behind all this, then who?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "We are about to find out." The cab stopped on Montague Street in front of a tall Georgian residence bearing the brass plaque of Langford and Merton Solicitors. Holmes stepped out first, walking with purpose to the door. Though it was nearly midnight, a dim glow still issued from a second-floor window. "Someone is working late," Holmes murmured, and rapped sharply on the door. After a few moments, a clerk answered, sleep-rumpled, clearly startled. "Mr. Langford?" Holmes asked. "He's still in conference," the clerk stammered, blinking. "At the three of us. But yes, come in, I'll inform him at once." Within 5 minutes, we stood in a warm oak-panelled office, the fire crackling and 2 decanters sitting untouched on a sideboard. Behind the desk sat a lean, severe man in a dark frock coat, his silver hair neatly combed, his face expressionless. He did not rise as we entered. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and his voice had the polished control of a barrister long accustomed to cross-examination. "Dr. Watson and Mr. Wetherell. How unexpected." "Not entirely," Holmes said evenly. "You may recall, Mr. Langford, that you once served as legal counsel to Baron Elric Wetherell. You were involved in the drafting of his initial will, before Bryce was brought in to amend it." Langford's fingers steepled. "I am retained." "On many matters, Mr. Holmes. You'll have to be more specific." "Very well, let me be precise. The codicil which disinherited Richard Wetherell was a forgery. A forgery signed under duress, with documents suppressed by Charles Bryce under your instruction. The motive? To protect the Crown's clandestine use of Richard as a decoy in an intelligence matter. and to conceal the identity of the true informant, whose connection to your office remain unexplained. Langford's eyes narrowed. You make bold accusations without evidence. But not without motive, Holmes said sharply. You knew the truth of Richard's innocence because you were the conduit between Lord Wetherell and the Foreign Office. You advised the Baron to quietly alter his will without naming the reason, so that the family's involvement in espionage would remain buried. And when Bryce grew uneasy, when he hinted at revealing the truth, you acted. Langford's face did not change, but the room had become oppressively still. I'm afraid you are mistaken. Am I? Holmes drew the Geneva letter from his pocket. Bryce received this 5 years ago, seeking information about the codicil. It bears ink consistent with your chamber's supply. See the faint iron gall discoloration at the lower margin. And the phrasing is identical to your correspondence with Bryce in the Wetherell estate file. Even your unique habit of underscoring rather than italicizing appears here. Langford said nothing. Holmes continued, his voice now steely. You coached Bryce to respond carefully. You feared Richard might return, and he did. When Bryce refused further complicity, you helped engineer his silence. Wetherell stepped forward. You destroyed my name to protect an unnamed traitor. Who was he, Langford? The solicitor finally moved. He stood and reached for the decanter. Holmes intercepted him with a flash of his hand. That will do, I think. You'll answer the question now. Langford hesitated, then sat again, the weight of inevitability beginning to press upon his shoulders. It was not about treason, he said at last. The Baron's younger brother, your uncle, was involved in arms trafficking through the Punjab. He would have brought disgrace on the family and serious diplomatic consequences. Elric feared exposure. He asked me to devise a legal means to shield the estate. Removing you from the line of succession allowed everything to pass quietly to a distant cousin instead. Bryce was paid to handle the legal misdirection, and when he balked, yes, I warned him. I did not kill him, Holmes, I frightened him. With what? I asked. Langford looked away. With the same whisper you've been chasing, a mixture we used in India to keep prisoners docile, vapors, enough to create hallucinations, panic. I had it recreated, delivered to Bryce's house via servant. I intended only to silence him, not end him. Holmes nodded grimly. Then someone else took your tool and turned it fatal. Langford said nothing more. An hour later, we delivered him to Scotland Yard. Lestrade received us with his usual blend of skepticism and reluctant admiration, though the evidence Holmes provided left little room for doubt. As the dawn broke over, Baker Street and a grey light filtered into our sitting room, Holmes finally sat back in his chair, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. I studied him in the firelight. You knew it was Langford from the start? No, Holmes said quietly. But I knew whoever orchestrated the whispers had access to both legal channels and chemical means, and only one man fit both profiles. And the final culprit, the one who turned vapor into murder. Holmes looked into the fire. We've yet to find them, Watson, but now that Langford's game is ended, they may make their final move. And when they do, he smiled, the faintest glint of excitement sparking in his eyes. We shall be waiting. The morning sun had risen pallid and thin over Baker Street, its light struggling through soot-streaked windows and the lingering residue of London's November damp. Holmes, however, remained unmoved by either weather or hour. He sat as still as a carving in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in the posture I knew well, deep concentration, masking rapid-fire mental calculus. I had slept no more than an hour myself, the events of the night replaying with a dogged persistence in my mind. Though Langford's confession had shed light on much, the Baron's concealment of his brother's crimes, the forging of the codicil, and the gas-borne whispers used to frighten Bryce, there remained one nagging inconsistency Holmes himself had not yet addressed aloud. You don't believe Langford killed Bryce, I said, not as a question but a statement of fact. Holmes's eyes opened, sharp and clear. No, he said simply. Langford wielded fear like a scalpel, precise, controlled, but the man who murdered Bryce used that same fear like a hammer, without finesse. The method was borrowed. I dare say Langford himself was manipulated, nudged along the edge of panic. by someone who stood to gain more from the solicitor's silence than even Bryce's. Then we're still missing a player. Precisely, Watson. And this player is the most dangerous of all, one who hides not behind legal precedent or family duty, but behind opportunity. I stood and moved to the hearth, warming my hands. Absently. What do we know? I asked. Who else was aware of the codicil's contents? Holmes rose and paced to the mantel, plucking his pipe from the shelf. He lit it with care, then spoke through curls of smoke. We must consider that the codicil was never widely known. Bryce was secretive, Langford even more so. But someone with proximity to both, managed to acquire not only the truth, but the gas compound Langford once had manufactured in India. That requires knowledge, resources, and patience. He turned and regarded me. Who profits from this chain of events, Watson? Not Langford. His control is broken. Not Wetherell. His name cleared, but no estate awaits him. So the beneficiary must be someone removed from suspicion, someone who stood to inherit through silence. Understanding began to dawn. The cousin who inherited the Wetherell estate? Holmes gave a single nod. Cousin by law, not blood. Sir Giles Trenton, a barrister of rising note. Wetherell Hall passed to him after Richard's exclusion from the will, and his name appears ever so briefly in Bryce's notes, under a list of private correspondences from nearly a decade ago. I missed it at first, but I remember the name now. Trenton once clerked for Langford's firm. I stared. He had access to both Bryce and Langford, and motive. Not only motive, Holmes said grimly, but the means to watch and wait as his predecessors eliminated one another. Without a word more, he turned to the desk and pulled out a folder I had seen him preparing earlier that morning. Within it was a single unopened letter, addressed in Holmes' own neat hand. I sent this last night, Watson, before we left Scotland Yard. An invitation to Sir Giles Trenton, requesting that he join us here at 11 this morning on a matter of grave legal consequence. I glanced at the clock. 10:52. As if cued by fate, a sharp knock came at the door. Holmes crossed the room and opened it himself. Sir Giles Trenton was younger than I had expected, barely 40, with neatly barbered hair and a jaw that looked hewn from good Anglo-Saxon stock. His eyes, however, were alert to a degree that unsettled me, watchful, calculating like a man who weighed every second for advantage. Mr. Holmes, he said, offering a brisk nod. Dr. Watson, you sent word regarding the Wetherell inheritance? Indeed, Holmes replied smoothly. Please do come in. Trenton entered with practiced confidence, his gloved hands neatly folded behind his back. He declined a seat, instead strolling to the window. I confess I was surprised, he said. The Wetherell matter was settled long ago. Bryce himself saw to it, did he not? He did, Holmes said, though not without external guidance. That guidance, we now know, came from Langford. And others? Trenton turned, the ghost of a smile on his lips. I assume you're referring to Mr. Wetherell's dramatic reappearance. A tragic business, all told. More tragic, Holmes said. For Charles Bryce, who died not of fright but by asphyxiation, poison administered through a device engineered to mimic the effects of Langford's Indian compound. A curious echo of a whisper, wouldn't you say? There was a flicker in Trenton's eye, a flash so brief it might have gone unnoticed had I not been watching. Holmes pressed on. Langford did not murder Bryce. He sent vapors to unnerve him, but someone else took that method and turned. Hit lethal. Someone who gained full legal possession of the Wetherell estate upon both Elric's death and Richard's disinheritance. Now Trenton's smile vanished. This is absurd. Holmes's voice was calm. Is it? Langford kept one record you overlooked, a receipt, for a vial of camphor and chloroform delivered to a private address. Not his own, but one paid for on his behalf. By you. Trenton said nothing. Holmes took a step forward. You visited Bryce the day before he died. You left a note, delivered through Mrs. Hudson, asking me to come. Clever. You planted the trail, then watched to see how I would follow it. But you made one mistake. He crossed to the desk and removed a final sheet of paper. A note. Familiar. In its handwriting. The note left on Bryce's desk. I heard the whisper again. This time it said, "You know too much. You wrote that, Trenton. But you used the same phrasing as in a letter you once sent to Langford 9 years ago. Word for word, in fact, from a legal memorandum. You recycle your phrases, Sir Giles. A fatal habit." Trenton stiffened, and I instinctively moved between him and the hearth, but Holmes raised a hand. "No need for violence," he said. "Your inheritance dies today, not by law but by truth. Scotland Yard is on its way." Trenton's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Holmes. There was no out, only silence. "You ruined my future," he said bitterly. "I had earned that title, the estate, everything." "No," Holmes replied, his voice iron. "You inherited a lie and turned it into murder, that is all." As footsteps pounded up, the stairs and Lestrade's voice rang through the hall. I saw Trenton's shoulders sag, not with grief but with the collapse of a scheme years in the making. The game had ended. But Holmes, already lighting his pipe, had clearly turned his mind to what puzzle might come next. The door burst open with a sharp crack as Lestrade entered, flanked by 2 constables, his overcoat still damp from the mist outside. The inspector took one glance at the scene, Holmes standing serenely by the desk, Sir Giles Trenton rigid near the window, and gave a thin-lipped nod. "Is this the man?" he asked curtly. Holmes gestured toward Trenton. "Sir Giles Trenton. You'll find a warrant for his arrest already drawn up at Scotland Yard, along with documentation linking him to the chemical agent used in Bryce's murder. I suggest you also seize any materials from his chambers at Temple Bar, especially those concerning the Wetherell estate." Trenton's mouth opened as if to object, but no sound emerged. Lestrade, clearly in no mood for defiance, gave a terse order, and the constables stepped forward. Trenton did not resist, though his expression as they led him away was one of tightly controlled fury, a mask cracking only at the edges. Once they were gone, and the flat had returned to its usual silence, I turned to Holmes. He had resumed his place by the fire, pipe in hand, his eyes distant. I knew that look. The case had been solved in its broadest sense, but something still nettled him. "You've exposed the murderer," I said. "Cleared Richard Wetherell's name and brought justice for Bryce. That's a full ledger by any account." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "justice can sometimes feel like a ledger with one column unresolved." I frowned, then realized what he meant. The traitor, the true informant, the one the Baron tried to protect. Holmes nodded slowly. "Langford gave us part of the truth, but there is a missing link, someone the Baron feared to name even in death, someone powerful, perhaps still alive. That loose thread remains, and I do not care for threads left dangling." A knock at the door interrupted us. This time it was neither constable nor client, but Richard Wetherell himself. He looked different in daylight, less like a man wronged and more like a man unburdened. He removed his hat and inclined his head. "I came to thank you," he said, "and to tell you something you should know." Holmes motioned for him to sit. "I received a letter yesterday," Wetherell continued, "delivered anonymously to my lodgings, no signature, no return address. But the contents, well, they unsettled me." He drew a folded paper from his coat and handed it to Holmes. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, and written in violet ink, a curious choice. Holmes read it aloud. "You have been exonerated, but you are not safe. The shadow that ruined you does not rest. Do not seek the final name, for it is protected by more than secrecy. It is protected by loyalty, and those who whisper know how to make silence permanent." Holmes reread it silently, then passed it to me. Wetherell leaned forward. "Don't frighten easily, Mr. Holmes, but I've lived long enough with the sensation of being hunted to know when it's returned. Someone doesn't want the rest of the truth uncovered." Holmes tapped the page thoughtfully. "This ink is of a type used only in select foreign embassies," he said. "A curious affectation, violet ink, favored by certain circles within. The continental legations. I've seen it before in dispatches from Vienna and Trieste." "You think this person is tied to a foreign power?" I asked. "Perhaps not directly, but the true informant, if still alive, would certainly have sought protection beyond British jurisdiction, and if that protection remains active, then we're not dealing with an isolated case of treason. We're dealing with an institutional compromise." He stood, energized again, pacing before the hearth. "Watson, consider this." Bryce was silenced not because of the will alone, but because he retained fragments of knowledge. Trenton exploited that. Langford was blackmailed into compliance. Yes, but also controlled. And now we find someone warning Wetherell off with language that suggests a collective interest, not personal vengeance, but a system protecting its own. Wetherell looked grim. "Then what can be done?" Holmes turned to the window, his voice low. "Something Langford said before his arrest has lingered with me. The Baron's younger brother was involved in arms trafficking through the Punjab, but we've never seen a name. It was always the brother or an informant. That anonymity, combined with this threat, tells me we are brushing against a very old, very dangerous network. One that does not tolerate exposure. I felt a chill not from the November air, but from the implications. You think the Baron's brother was the traitor, and that someone is still protecting his name?" "I do," Holmes said. "And I believe Langford lied about his death. We must find records of his movements following the Codicil's amendment. If he disappeared, rather than died, that would suggest he was relocated, hidden away, perhaps, even given a new identity." Wetherell stood, his jaw set. "Then let me help. He was my uncle. If there's a record to be found, I'll find it." Holmes nodded. "Begin with shipping logs, India office dispatches. See if any record exists of a Harold Wetherell, that was his name, I believe, boarding a vessel in or out of Calcutta under official orders around the time your father rewrote his will." Wetherell nodded and left, his determination clearly ignited. I turned to Holmes. "Isn't this beyond our scope now? You've uncovered a murder, solved a legal fraud and cleared an innocent man. Do we chase ghosts now?" Holmes looked at me with that familiar glint. "Watson, this began with a whisper, a murder disguised as fear. But someone has spent 2 decades ensuring no one listens too closely. That suggests not only guilt, but the presence of secrets whose value still matters. I do not chase ghosts. I follow echoes, and sometimes the faintest echo reveals the clearest truth." He moved to the desk, opened his ledger, and wrote a single word: Harold. "Until we know who truly spoke first," he said softly. The whisper remains unfinished, and in the quiet that followed, I realized we were no longer dealing with a single crime, but with a shadow so vast that it could only be glimpsed in pieces, reflected in dead men's papers, in unsigned letters, and in Holmes' relentless pursuit of logic amid the hush of conspiracy. The following days passed in a slow-burning tension, not unlike the moments before a storm breaks over the countryside. Holmes worked with quiet intensity, a kind of simmering brilliance that revealed itself only through fragments, an offhand remark here, a sharply worded telegram there, and the occasional sleepless night spent poring over ledgers and shipping manifests from the dusty archives of the India office. I assisted where I could, chasing down records in Lambeth and Whitehall, while Holmes leaned on contacts within the Foreign Office and certain shadowy figures from his more irregular associations. It was on the 4th evening, just as the gas lamps began to glow amber along Baker Street, that Holmes laid the final piece before me. He dropped a sheaf of papers onto the table beside the fire, his eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. "Harold Wetherell," he said, "did not die in 1882 as officially recorded. He vanished." I looked up from the notes I'd been compiling. "Vanished?" Holmes nodded. "The shipping logs show a Harold Wetherell departing Bombay, under escort aboard a government-chartered vessel, bound not for England, but for Port Said. His name then disappears from all known registers. No death certificate, no obituary, no further mention in any correspondence, not even a footnote in the family's estate records. He was expunged." I turned over the top document, a copy of the ship's manifest. Who else was aboard? A diplomatic attaché, a colonial physician, and one Geoffrey Blackthorne, a man of interest I've encountered once before. "Where?" "In Cairo," Holmes replied, his tone tightening. "During the Constantinople incident, the one I referenced in my monograph on Balkan forgeries, Blackthorne operated under 3 identities. He was a broker in arms, intelligence, and poisons. If Wetherell fell in with him, then the Baron's concern was not misplaced. His brother had become more than a liability. He had become a weapon. And still alive? Holmes exhaled a plume of pipe smoke, letting the silence answer. That night, we were awoken by a knock at the door, frantic, sharp, and unmistakably urgent. I answered it, robe hastily drawn about my shoulders, to find Richard Wetherell standing on the threshold, wind-blown and pale. "I found something," he said without preamble, pushing past into the sitting room. He held out a thin, red-bound notebook. I was combing through a box of my father's old private files. Most had been stripped, either by Langford or someone else, but this one had fallen behind the cabinet. It's his private journal. There's a passage you'll want to read. Holmes took the book and turned to the marked page. He read aloud March 3rd, 1883. "They've agreed to remove Harold quietly. Too many questions now, too many connections. The man, Blackthorne, will handle the extraction. I am to sign a second will, omitting his name entirely. Richard must never... No, he thinks Harold merely died abroad. It is better this way, better a whisper than a scandal. I do not trust Langford fully. He seems increasingly beholden to someone else. Someone whose loyalty is not to me." Holmes looked up. "There it is, Watson. The Baron feared not only Harold, but the power behind Langford, someone who remained unseen, yet guided these events even before Trenton emerged. And now that person is watching again," Wetherell said grimly. "The note I received, 'Do not seek the final name,' that wasn't just a warning, it was a command." Holmes closed the journal with a quiet snap. "Then we must disobey it." He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the fog. "I believe Harold Wetherell is alive. I believe he never returned to England, but continued his operations under an assumed identity. If so, then he must be drawing support from within. Such men do not act alone. Someone in London has kept him protected, funded, informed." I stepped beside him. "A patron within the government? Possibly, or a beneficiary, someone who knew that as long as Harold remained hidden, their own position remained unassailable." Wetherell, who had seated himself, gave a tired laugh. "And to think all this began because I wanted to clear my name." "Sometimes," Holmes said, "justice begins as a personal flame and ends by exposing an entire city of shadows." He turned back to the table and began sorting through the notes again. Then he paused. "There is one thing we haven't yet done." "What's that?" I asked the dead. I stared at him. "Holmes, if that's meant poetically—" "Not at all," he said. "You recall Bryce's study? The cracked mirror? Of course, you said it was unremarkable." "At the time," Holmes said, "but something struck me odd after. The mirror was cracked not inwards, as though something hit it, but outwards, as if something behind it pushed through. Within an hour we were in Kensington again, lanterns in hand, navigating the chilly silence of number 17 Bleakmere Row. Lestrade had allowed us access under strict condition, though he dismissed it as Holmes's usual postscript theatrics. The Bean sitting room was untouched since the investigation. Holmes moved immediately to the mirror, eyes scanning the edges with clinical detachment. Then, with a quick flick of his blade, he pried at the wooden moulding. Behind the mirror's backing was a shallow recess, and within it, a packet of letters bound in faded twine. Holmes laid them gently across the desk and began to read, his lips tightening as he progressed. I stepped beside him and caught the name repeated over and over. H.R.W., Harold Richard Wetherell. The letters were addressed not to Bryce, but to Langford. The contents were damning. Updates on arms trades, bribes to overseas officials, and instructions for laundering funds through shell ventures in the Midlands. One letter ended chillingly. "You are not to release the full codicil. It remains an instrument of leverage. Remember, I can silence you as I silenced others. The whisper has never failed me." Holmes looked up. "That, Watson, is the voice we've heard since the beginning. Not metaphor, not mystery. The whisper is Harold's signature, his weapon, and now finally we have his hand in ink. And the final name?" I asked. Holmes tapped the last envelope. "There. The recipient of his final dispatch." I read the name. A high-ranking official, still active, recently promoted. Holmes began folding the letters into an envelope marked "Confidential" for the eyes of the Home Secretary. "This is no longer a private case," he said quietly. "Now it becomes history, Now the Empire must reckon with what it whispered to protect. And with that, the case that began in silence grew louder with every truth it unearthed. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the city had begun to stir beneath a low, grey sky. The early clatter of milk carts echoed faintly through the fog, and the smell of coal smoke settled thick in the air. Holmes, unusually quiet, moved with purpose as he sealed the bundle of letters in heavy parchment, then affixed his wax seal, a simple H in precise relief. "This goes directly to Whitehall," he said, handing the envelope to me. "To the Home Secretary's office, no intermediaries. Use the civil dispatch box at St. James's Square. No names, only my mark. It will be recognized." I accepted the envelope, the weight of it far heavier than the paper within. It was not merely a report. It was a dismantling, a quiet but irrevocable exposure of a man who had moved through the corridors of power under a false identity for over 2 decades. Harold Wetherell, once erased from history, now risked being immortalized in disgrace. As I made ready to leave, Holmes stopped me with a glance. "Be wary, Watson. If the man behind this web knows we've unmasked him, he may not wait for the system to decide his fate. You think he'll flee?" Holmes gave the faintest shake of his head. "No. Flight is for those who fear retribution. This man will act, not run." He said nothing more, and I left with the packet. Feeling eyes at my back as I made my way through the awakening streets. At St. James's, I delivered the envelope into the locked courier box, watched it disappear behind polished brass, then turned for Baker Street with a strange sense of finality in my step. But when I returned, Holmes was not in the flat. Mrs. Hudson, visibly perturbed, met me at the top of the stairs. "Mr. Holmes went out not 10 minutes after you left, Doctor. Said he was taking the air, but he took his cane and gloves." My concern deepened. Holmes never took the air when a case was active. I checked the desk. His pipe remained unlit. His violin stood untouched, but on the blotter lay a single sheet of notepaper upon which he had scrawled 3 words: "Whispers don't wait." I felt a cold prickling along my spine. There was no address, no signature, only the phrase, an echo of what had haunted us from the beginning. I paced the sitting room in a rising anxiety, every minute stretching into a skein of unease. At last, close to midday, the front door creaked. Open below, I hurried down expecting Holmes, but it was Wetherell. His face was pale and his coat torn at the shoulder. "They took him," he said breathlessly. "Holmes is gone." My breath caught. "What do you mean, taken? Who?" "I was following a hunch of my own," he said. "I returned to the old Langford offices, hoping to find a secondary ledger, something to track the financial trail. But I saw Holmes there. He must have followed the same thought. I watched from across the street. Then a carriage pulled up. 2 men stepped out, one short, stocky, the other tall, wearing a foreign cut of coat. They surrounded him. Holmes didn't resist. He got in willingly. But it wasn't a police carriage. It was unmarked, and it turned toward the river. My mind reeled. Why wouldn't he resist? Because he wanted to know where they were. "Taking him," Wetherell said grimly. "And perhaps who was waiting?" We wasted no time. Armed with only instinct and urgency, we hired a cab and followed the route Wetherell had described. Holmes would have allowed himself to be taken only if he saw advantage, or if it was the final step in drawing out the hidden hand behind everything. And if that was so, then we were moving quickly toward the conclusion of the case, or toward its final cost. Near the docklands east of Blackfriars, we found the carriage abandoned, its interior still warm, the driver gone. We followed the drag marks in the soft dirt to a narrow door recessed between 2 derelict warehouses. Wetherell glanced at me and I nodded. He kicked the door in with a crack and we rushed inside. The air was close and chemical. Faint trails of vapor lingered, the telltale bite of the gas we had smelled before. But this was no whisper. It was a haze of silence, and there, tied to a chair in the center of the room, was Holmes. His head was bowed slightly, but at our entrance he lifted it and offered a tight, familiar smile. "Just in time," he rasped. I feared they'd overdo the dose. We rushed to untie him. Wetherell sliced through the ropes while I examined his pupils and pulse. Holmes waved me off, already rising. They drugged me only lightly, enough to slow the tongue, not the brain. They wanted me lucid. Who? I demanded. Who was here? Holmes turned toward the far wall. A desk sat there, old and splintering, with a candle burned nearly to the base. Upon it, a single photograph remained. Sepia-toned, the edges, curled with age. Holmes picked it up and showed us. A young man in colonial uniform smiling. And next to him, unmistakable even in youth, was Geoffrey Blackthorne. Below, a handwritten caption, Peshawar, 1881. H.W. and G.B., Harold Wetherell and Blackthorne, Holmes said. Together from the beginning, not just partners in crime. Watson, symmetrical minds. Wetherell was the strategist. Blackthorne, the instrument. They were both here? I asked. No, only Blackthorne. Harold has already vanished again, but Blackthorne stayed just long enough to deliver a final message. Holmes retrieved another note, this one pinned beneath the photograph. You've unspooled the thread, but the cloth is vast. The empire is sown with men like me. Find one, and another steps in. We are the whisper that never dies. Enjoy your victory, detective. It is smaller than you think. Wetherell clenched his fists. He's mocking us. He's warning us, Holmes said, and perhaps hoping we stop here. I looked to Holmes, expecting weariness. But what I saw in his face was something colder, resolved. This game is not over, Watson, he said. We've cut the cord on one of the Empire's hidden puppeteers, but the theater remains, and I intend to pull back every curtain. Outside, the fog had lifted, and the wind off the river carried a bite sharper than before. The silence that had begun this case no longer whispered. It echoed, and I knew then that Holmes would not rest until that echo was traced to its deepest source. We returned to Baker Street under a flat sky, the wind biting sharper now, as if London itself were aware that something long dormant had stirred. Holmes said little during the ride, his head bowed, fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the top of his cane. I knew better than to interrupt. He was turning over the last pieces in a puzzle that refused to resolve cleanly. The photograph, the note, the disappearance of Harold Wetherell. It was all too neatly timed, too perfectly vanishing. When we entered the sitting room, Holmes went straight to the fire and stirred it into flame with practiced indifference. Then he lit his pipe and stood before the hearth, the smoke curling around his face like mist clinging to the surface of still water. Blackthorne was meant to be found, he said finally. Or at least his trace, the photograph, the note. It was a staged end, a curtain drop. Harold Wetherell leaves the country under cover of silence, and Blackthorne plays the phantom that warns us away. It is too carefully constructed. He wanted us to feel we had reached the limit. But we haven't, I said. We've exposed the foundation of an intelligence network hidden in plain sight, implicated a high official in London, and unmasked a man who had been dead on paper for over 2 decades. Holmes turned, his gaze sharp. And yet the one person who truly orchestrated it all remains at large. Harold Wetherell still breathes, Watson. I can feel it. Men like him don't vanish. They reposition. He knew when to fold the operation here. And we gave him the signal by getting too close. I frowned. Then what remains to be done? Holmes crossed to his desk and opened a drawer. From it he drew a map, folded into quarters and yellowed with age. He unfurled it across the table, smoothing the creases. It was a chart of trade routes from Bombay to Constantinople, annotated in Holmes's hand. This was never about England. Alone. The Wetherell affair, the false codicil, the whispers, they were symptoms of a broader illness. Harold and Blackthorne were only 2 agents in a chain that spans coasts. What Bryce knew, what Langford tried to contain, was one node. The real center of gravity lies further east. His finger tapped a spot just south of Smyrna. Here, he said. A name has surfaced in Blackthorne's past dealings. A man called Ferrin, once a colonial quartermaster, now posing as a shipping magnate. But I suspect he's more than a middleman. I believe Ferrin is the link Harold used to vanish, and perhaps the only man who can lead us to where he's gone. I stared at the map. You're suggesting we follow him out of England. This is no longer a domestic affair. Nor was it ever truly one, Holmes replied. The Empire masks many things beneath its flags. This is not just a case. It is a reckoning. There was a knock at the door then. Not frantic nor timid, measured. Mrs. Hudson answered it, and moments later a man was shown in, tall and broad-shouldered, with the posture of a soldier and the eyes of a man who had seen more than he would ever say aloud. "Colonel Travers," Holmes greeted him. "You received my telegram." Travers nodded curtly. "I did. You were right. Harold Wetherell's name turned up in an intercepted communiqué 3 days ago. Not as Harold, but as Hanif Walid. The cipher was weak. We cracked it. The message originated from Beirut and was routed through Smyrna." I felt the atmosphere change. The smoke in the room seemed to thicken. "What did it say?" I asked. Travers reached into his coat and handed Holmes a slip of thin grey paper. Holmes read aloud. "The files have passed. Silence maintained. Withdrawal underway. The whisper continues beneath new skin. HW." He lowered the paper slowly. "Then we are not merely chasing ghosts," Holmes murmured. "We are chasing something that has learned to survive by becoming invisible." Travers took a step forward. "Do you want us to move on him?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. Let him believe he's escaped. Let him settle. And then we strike where he thinks himself safest." The colonel gave a stiff nod. "We'll keep him in sight, discreetly." When Travers had left, the silence returned. Holmes stood a moment longer, then turned toward me. "You asked what remains to be done, Watson," he said. "What remains is the truth. Not merely who killed whom or why, but what system allowed such things to unfold without notice for so long. Who permitted the whisper to grow into something louder than the law? And when do we pursue it?" He looked out the window where the fog had begun to creep in again, pale tendrils wrapping around the corners of the city. "Soon," he said. "But not yet. There is one more report to be made, one more stone to overturn." I followed his gaze. Outside, the Empire marched on, blind to the truth still buried in its shadow, and inside, Sherlock Holmes was already preparing to unearth them. The case, it seemed, had not ended. It had only just begun. It was nearly a month later, on a damp and windless evening, when the last piece fell into place. The events that had begun with a whisper had rippled outward, into courts, into ministries, and into private chambers, where men once untouchable now found themselves answering questions whispered no longer. The Home Secretary had acted on Holmes's sealed report with a rare combination of discretion and resolve. Langford's files were quietly requisitioned, Trenton's trial postponed for further inquiry, and at least 3 known associates of Geoffrey Blackthorne had disappeared into the dark bureaucracy of the Crown's own justice. But the name Holmes had kept hidden, Harold Wetherell, had not reappeared until today. We were at breakfast when the telegram came. Holmes read it in silence, then passed it to me without comment. It bore the mark of Colonel Travers and read, "Simply Ferrin is dead, poisoned before arrest. Among his effects, 1 letter. Destination, Zurich. Initials, H.W. Holmes," stood slowly. "The man knew too much, and the man who sent the message to Zurich knows it." I looked at him. "You know where Harold is, don't you?" He nodded once. "I've known for days. We travelled that night, the Channel crossing rough with winter swell. From Calais we continued by rail, through snow-dusted villages and candle-lit stations until we reached Zurich, a city of bankers, codes and shadows that whispered in a dozen tongues. There, at a small sanitarium overlooking the frozen lake, we found him. He was thinner now, his once imposing frame reduced by time and secrecy. A silver beard obscured much of his face, but the eyes, sharp, watching, gave him away at once. Harold Wetherell, alias Hanif Walid, alias nothing at all, stood when Holmes entered the room. He did not appear surprised. "I wondered how long it would take you," he said quietly. "I half hoped you wouldn't bother." Holmes shut the door behind us. "You killed Bryce." Wetherell tilted his head. "He had a heart condition. A little vapor, a little fright. It's amazing what the body does under suggestion. You silenced Langford through fear, and Trenton through manipulation. You left Blackthorne behind to give the illusion of a finale. But you left one thing uncalculated." Wetherell smiled faintly. "You?" Holmes shook his head. "Your own brother's silence. He documented everything. In the end, your family gave you away." Wetherell turned to the window, staring out at the still waters of Lake Zurich. I did what I had to do. For the Empire. For order. You see conspiracies, I see structure. There are things the public needn't know. You reveal the infection, but what then? What fills the gap? Truth, Holmes said simply. That is my task. The rest belongs to history. Wetherell chuckled softly. History is written by the whisperers, Mr. Holmes. You've only chased the echo. Holmes stepped closer. Then let this be the last. There was no struggle. The Swiss authorities took Wetherell that afternoon. The charges would remain sealed, the trial secret. But the web had been disturbed, the nest uncovered. Even whispers lose their power when spoken aloud. We returned to London in silence. And on a grey morning in Baker Street, with the fire low and the world once more at peace, I asked Holmes a final question. Do you believe it's over? Holmes stared into the hearth, where the last coals glowed red beneath the ash. No, he said, but it's no longer hidden. And that, Watson, is where all endings must begin. And with that he turned to his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and played, not a song of triumph, but a single note, clear, steady, and not a whisper.